listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast by Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, Dr. Fredrick J. Long, Dr. Mario Melendez, Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and J. M. Smith. Welcome and enjoy.
Well, I want to welcome you again to another edition of Ephesians Greek Reading Group, and we're right in the middle of the book, getting to the heart of the matter right now in chapter 3. And there's going to be a transition from this, what is often considered a digression in Ephesians 3, 1 through 13, which really lays out and shows how Paul himself is an example of one who receives God's grace and receives this grace by the working of God's power, according to the working of God's power. So right in the middle of the 3, 1 to 13 is this prepositional phrase that describes the power that God gives, through which he gives the grace, and according to which he gives the grace to Paul. And so this, grace, a lot of times we wonder what grace means. There's some, common definitions like unmerited favor, and I think that is good. I think another dimension of grace that is little appreciated is the fact that it's empowerment. It's an empowerment to do and to be differently in the world. And this was stressed by one of my exegesis professors, and really it comes out of Dr. Wong, Joseph Wong. It really comes out of the ancient Mediterranean context where grace is a term used of gift exchange and gift giving. And when a gift was given, it was meant to be reciprocated. And so this word charis, grace, could be used both to describe the gift, but then also in the attitude of the recipient and response of grace or thanks in return. So when it comes to God's grace, we really need to think about, why is he offering us grace? We certainly don't do anything to deserve it. And so it is an unmerited favor, but God gives his grace in order for us to do something with it. We're transformed by it, and then we're, I think, motivated and strengthened and empowered by it. So God's grace is an enlivening force in our lives. And of course it comes by way of Christ and the Spirit. God gives everyone grace. He's not stingy with grace. He measured out to each person, but he gives grace for us to do something with it. And even if we don't have faith in him, he's still wooing us with what's called a prevenient grace, a grace that goes before, a grace that is, in Calvinist circles, they call it common grace. And this is a grace that extends to God's created order, and particularly to us as human beings made in his image, that we, even though we're fallen and that image is marred, it is not eradicated. And part of that remnant, that part of God's image that is there, that's grace. And the fact that we can live and move and have our being in the world is due to God's grace. And so his grace goes before us, woos us back into his presence, tries to woo us, and the grace goes before and enables that even to take place in us. And so all our human capacities, faculties are dependent upon God's grace. Now, it doesn't mean that he does it for us. It just means that he enables. And so he's looking for us to respond as free agents, or agents who can be freed, really freed agents who are freed from sin. And that comes by way of his grace. And he extends that, and he's just looking for us to move. And when we move just a little bit towards him, He's already moved towards us, and when we respond in moving back to him, he responds even more. And so there becomes a cycle of grace and giving of grace that is empowering. And so Paul, right here in chapter 3, we see him explaining how he became a servant according to the gift of God's grace, which was given to me, he says, according to the working of his power. And then he says again, to me, to the least of all the saints, it was given this grace. And so the text pivots right here. And it's such a powerful point to think about, because really Paul is describing his imprisonment, and is because of proclaiming the gospel. And this gospel is open for Jews and Gentiles alike. This is God's plan. And at the heart of it is God's empowerment given to Paul, this grace. And so he doesn't want them to be discouraged. That's how he ends. He goes, I ask that you not be discouraged by my afflictions. So he doesn't want them to be discouraged. And this is their glory. And really, why is it their glory? Well, their glory is as human beings made in God's image that now are being called into the gospel to join God's people, to be a part of God's people. And Paul's bringing this message, and so even though he's suffering evil, like he's a prisoner, he's received all kinds of hardships, he says, don't let this trouble you, because actually this is all a part of a very glorious thing. It's your glory that I'm proclaiming, in the sense that God is honoring you and bringing you into his purposes. So don't be discouraged. And so this then leads to Paul's bowing the knee, bending the knee. He says, on account of this, for this reason. And we see something very odd here in 14. The tuto karen is a prepositional phrase, but the object and the preposition are reversed. Now, a lot of times when we see a prepositional phrase in Koine Greek, we think of it as it's got to begin with the preposition, and if the head noun follows, the object, the preposition follows. But in classical Greek, you had a lot of flexibility, and you had prepositions being post-positioned after their object. And here we have a little remnant of that with this preposition karen, which is really interesting because it's related to the word charis, grace. So it's probably not accidental that Paul is using it because of the association. And so it's interesting. He's using it. It shows a reverse pattern. It's really it's showing a causal connection. It's almost equivalent to like a dia tuto, for this reason, or dia tuton, on account of this, I should say, dia tuton with the accusative. And so, but here we have this karen, tuto karen, on account of this. So that this is referring back to what he's just been discussing. And so then it's showing that because of what he's just been discussing, he does what he does. And so he says, I bow. I bend my knees. I bend my knees. Kapto tagnonata mu. I bend my knees to the Father. Now this is a posture of prayer. And we don't always see people or understand what posture they're in. They may just say that they're praying. But here Paul is describing his posture of prayer. And we have to ask, why is he describing it in this way? Well, kneeling is an abject form of recognition of the superiority of the one to whom you're before. And so when he's bowing the knee, it's interesting that there are political connotations to this. This is something that you do before kings, is you bow before them. And so I think there's some sense that Paul is here acknowledging God's kingliness, certainly his sovereignty, and of course, as you may know of my work on Ephesians, I believe it's thoroughly political. So Daniel is depicted in this way, He's not going to bend the knee to the emperor, but he will bend in prayer to God and pray. So it becomes, I think, a symbol of defiant prayer also when we kind of look at it in its context. And this becomes important when we think about how Paul describes the Father. So I bend my knees to the Father. From whom? From whom? So ex ou is starting a relative pronoun clause because ou is a relative pronoun. It's a prepositional phrase, and the ou is going back to the Father, Patria, which is referring to God. And Paul's going to say something about passa patria, and uranus ke epiges onomazete, from whom every family in heaven and on earth are named. Now, if we translate this as family, which is often done, here's the NASB text. And by the way, I should just point out that I'm using a color coding scheme, and you can see it at the bottom here. I've applied it to the Greek text, and it can show up on the English text. And the word for family, you can see, is related to pater. It's a cognate, patria and pater, or patera. And so there's a wordplay going on right here, and you miss that if you're just looking at an English translation. So what does Paul mean by this? Well, we have to ask, what is a patria? And a patria is a family, more basically, a clan. It can also, though, refer to a people or nation. So it's a broad-reaching term. And I suggest, actually, a translation that helps us get to what patria is about, preserving its linkage to father. And so I suggest fatherland. Now, that being maybe too narrow, but it does connect it to pater in a more direct way. Also, very intriguingly, there was a title, a very prestigious and important title for the Roman emperors that Augustus received. Cicero also received it, but then the emperors after Augustus, it became a part of their, one among many of their names and titles, and that was Pater Patriae. And this meant father of the fatherland, Pater Patriae. And it's represented on coins, and I'm going to show you some of these coins. So here's a presentation I gave looking at this. So Cicero received this title, saving Rome from the Catiline conspiracy, and then Julius Caesar as well. And this title is particularly seen how important it is in Augustus's res gestae, that is, his deeds of accomplishment. This is like an autobiographical document which was monumented in different places around the Mediterranean world. One, the most famous being in Rome. And he lists his accomplishments, his deeds of accomplishments. That's what res gestae means in Latin. And he does it roughly chronologically, but he also groups things together by theme. Now, what's interesting is he does it out of chronological ordering and brings the listing to a climax with what he thought was the most important accomplishment and honor and reward that he received, and that was the title Pater Patriae. And so this is how important this is. Now, on coinage, it's often represented simply as PP, sometimes with pater. And so here's some different coins from the era, starting with Augustus. And you can see Patria on it. By the way, this is the Jupiter's eagle, laying claim and ownership over the orbs, that is the world. So you have other coins that have it sometimes fully written out, but then later, this is Caligula's coin, but then also other ones just with PP. So I think that Paul is probably alluding to this title. And the reason why is because look at the scope and scale of Patria. So it's every Patria. Okay, for one, this is every claim to family or fatherland or whatever. It's subordinated. It gets its name from God the Father in heaven and upon earth. So upon earth, the most prestigious family to belong to would be the Roman family, to be in the Roman people, and preeminently represented by the fatherland, preeminently represented by the Patriae title. So from whom every family or fatherland in heaven and on earth is named. And so while Paul is bowing his knees, he's also acknowledging there is only one Father, and it's from him that everything else is derived, every other thing that could be named, that can be named, including even one of the most prestigious imperial titles, Pater Patriae. So he's bowing his knees for what purpose? Verse 16, we get the purpose of that. With this ina, with the subjunctive mood. Now this could be understood as a purpose statement, but also as the content of the implied prayer. And it's kind of sometimes, it's hard to differentiate that sometimes. What is what? Is this the content of his prayer or the purpose of his prayer? And they begin to coalesce. So in order that he would give to you according to the wealth of his glory, and by the way, this wealth is extensive, and the glory, of course, is immeasurable. So this is a good modifier to have, that his giving corresponds to the measure of his wealth, and particularly his glorious wealth. If we understand this glory as an adjectival genitive, I think it has more concreteness to that. I think it refers to his renown and that which is glorious innately to God. So I don't want to just change that to an adjective too quickly, but to take it at its face value as a noun. So according to the wealth of his glory in power. Now this is a dative of means. Now this is kind of standing there, dative of means, and really the content of the gift, the giving he give to you, is this infinitive, to be strengthened. So this is where the dative of means comes into play then. It's fronted, it's placed before the verb, it is an arthrous, that is without an article. That also helps stress it because power is already a known entity in the discourse. We saw it up above, the working of his power. So really Paul is connecting some dots here, is that he's received God's power, grace and power, and now he's saying, I'm praying that you would receive it as well, that you'd be strengthened by that same power. By power. Be strengthened by power. And the means of that, dia with the genitive, is his Spirit. God's Spirit is a mediator of God's presence. but also of God's love and power. And so here we have the Spirit involved in this exchange. And really, it's a Trinitarian exchange, because we're going to see, well, we've already seen it. It's with the Father. So the Father's the one who's granting this, giving. And then we have the Spirit, which is mediating with, and somehow in relation to power. And then we're going to see that the goal of this strengthening in verse 17 is that Christ would dwell in our hearts. And he complements the Trinity, the Father, Spirit, and Christ. So he grants, so Paul's praying that he would grant that you would be strengthened through his Spirit with power. Be strengthened. This is an aorist infinitive. Now where is this strengthening occurring? We have two things that explain how, by means of power and through his Spirit, but where? Ton iso anthropon, in the inner person, Now this people may identify this as a equivalent of en, the preposition en, but while that may be, I think it's also important to recognize when does that substitution for en take place? When and why? In other words, choice implies meaning. This east, I think, ramps up en and also describes a destination and a location. So destination and location, and that combination of destination, purpose, and location is why east is probably used here. Whereas en may talk about location, east is destination and helps stress that purpose or that goal or destination, that extension into that location. So how important is it that we're strengthened in our persons, inside our inner persons? And that's what this eso communicates. Now, you can see it's blue, and that's an adverb, but it's being used adjectively. It's being sandwiched between the article and the noun and functioning adjectively. In the inner, it's often translated the inner a person. Now, it's unfortunate that we don't use more gender-inclusive language. Honestly, anthropon simply means a person. And this makes it just more gender-neutral and available. There's no restriction here. So I know that this man is kind of an older English translation, kind of a generic man, but I think we need to move into a more gender-inclusive translation. And particularly this word means that. In fact, there's a passage in 1 Peter that uses anthropos to describe women. Women alone, not women and men, but a woman. So we know that it's translated, it can be just translated and refer simply to the person aspect of being a human being. Now this strengthening by power through the Holy Spirit in our inner persons has its own purpose, and that is represented by this next infinitive, that Christ would dwell through faith in your hearts. And what a glorious thing that is. He would take up residence. And this is really temple language here. He's dwelling down. Kat oikeo. He's dwelling in us. And this is really the glory of the gospel. And the truth of the gospel is that God reveals himself inside of us, in his Son Jesus. Christ can take up residence in us, in our hearts. And what a blessed experience that is, and privilege to have Christ living in us. And he does so through faith. And this is really all that God ever wants from us, is just simply a trust. That's what faith means, is a trust. Not just some intellectual assent, some knowledge that we ascribe to. It does involve that, but it involves more than that. It involves a trusting of who God is at his word, a trusting in his promises, a trusting in his goodness despite what our circumstances look like. And believe me, that's not always easy. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. This is what Paul helps us to understand in Galatians. So our belief is so important to allow this to happen. And the question that occurs to me is why do we need so much strength for this to take place? Because Paul's really ramping up the strength language and the power language. And my hunch on this is that this is the deep work of God in our lives, to shine in dark places, to make room for Christ. There's power needed. He needs to do some deep inner work in us and healing that can only be done through his Spirit, and has to be done with power, because there are little strongholds, there are resistances, hesitancies, fears that grip us. There's a gripping, and some of this is deep, wounding, deep, instinctual, basal kind of wounding that we've all experienced, hurts that we've nursed. Sometimes we've participated in the nursing of these grudges and hurts. And so God needs to do some deep work in our hearts with power, very powerfully. And the good news is that his power and grace is stronger than human sin. It's not a competition. What's stronger, human sin or God's grace? That question came to me while teaching through Romans many years ago, and it struck me how we often think sin is stronger. It's not. God's grace is stronger. And so we need to live into that reality, and that allows Christ then to dwell in our hearts through faith. And that's what we bring to the table, is trust. That's part of a relationship, the fundamental aspect of love, actually. Love trusts, love hopes. Trusting is a fundamental need in relationships, and to the extent that we can't do that, we break the relationship. And that's why faith is even needed for this. Because God doesn't force himself on us. As much as we might want that, need that perhaps, he doesn't. That's not his normal way of doing things. He doesn't do that because he respects our integrity and our freedom. And our freedom is ultimately expressed, though, in relationship when we trust. And I can't think of a better person to trust than God. And so we're reaching a really important point here, because we have the Trinity, the full Trinity engaged. We have God the Father, we've got the Holy Spirit, and we've got Jesus converging inside of us. And that is a very powerful thing. And so he continues in verse 17 with this expression, in love, rooted and grounded, or founded, really founded, building on this temple metaphor. Pun intended, building on the temple metaphor. It really just means to found like a structure. A themelios is a foundation. And so this is the verb form. And what are these doing here? Well, grammatically it's jarring in a couple ways. First, they're nominative cases, that is the case of the subject, and yet we've been in the midst of infinitive clauses which would normally take accusative subjects. So it's startling in that respect. Secondly, they're perfect tense participles. This is why they're in the yellow highlight. Just helps alert me to perfect tense verb forms. The perfect tense stresses continuing results or effects. So it's a more dynamic description of verbal action. So in Greek you have perfective aspect, imperfective aspect, and then perfect tense aspect, which is resultant state. And so this is really stressing a dynamic process leading to a continued effect. And so all these things combine, and there's a third reason why these are startling, and that is because they're pulled forward out of the clause that they grammatically belong in. So if we go to this in a clause, we get a purpose statement. And at this point, the infinitive is reset, in a sense. The verb of the clause is reset to a subjunctive mood verb, which can take nominative cases. Like I said, the accusative case is normally found with infinitives. So these nominative participles really are being pulled forward in front of their clause. In Greek, while you might have learned that there's variable word order, which is true, kind of, it's mainly true, but on the other hand, Greek is arranged kind of by clauses that tend to keep things sandwiched together. Now you can violate that rule by pulling things out of a clause into a fronted position for effect. It's called prolepsis. It's a proleptic use. And it's for effect. It's certainly for effect. So it adds stress to these, because what's happening is that we're experiencing them before the grammar makes sense of them. And so what's happened when they're pulled forward, the cognitive effect is that they have a framing function. They provide an important framework. And probably, too, in terms of information flow, there's some question about in love here. Now, we're looking at the UBS text, the United Bible Society Greek text, and they actually have a punctuation apparatus that is signified by these letters here. Now, notice that A tells us that the Westcott Hort text and the Revised English Bible have no comma here, but rather put the comma after love. And this would mean then, this would suggest that Christ dwelling in our hearts through faith is in love. That this prepositional phrase in love is modifying this infinitive. He dwells in our hearts in love. So this is an interpretive decision where to put this modifier. Now, it may be that it's doing double duty, and that one way that Paul wanted to help convey that double duty is to pull these participles out of their clause, abut it directly to the in love, so that the in love can both be looking back and modifying dwell, as well as looking forward to frame our strengthening. So it may be functioning in a double duty, partly because of this forwarding construction, this proleptic construction that we're seeing here. So this is kind of an interpretive decision that interpreter struggles with. What is it modifying? Is it going back? Is it going forward? Is it possible it's doing both? And I think sometimes constructions are straddling the fence for a good reason, and that is because they are informing both what has just come and also what follows. Now, what is the purpose of all this strengthening and Christ dwelling in us? Well, we have this Ina clause, which provides a further layer of purpose. We've been seeing a cascading set of purposes, and it gets deeper and deeper. It gets piled higher and higher in a good sense. It's kind of hard to track. You have to just kind of understand that there's a building, and we're going to see the climax, and we're actually coming almost to the climax of God's purposes. Like, what is God after? What is he doing? Well, this dwelling of Christ is for further strength, to strengthen us. And really, this verb strength has it's strengthened itself in form. It has an extra X on the front. So the verb eskuo means strengthen. Exeskuo means to be really strengthened. So he's ramping up the meaning by adding this prepositional prefix onto the verb. It's almost like to max. Like, think of the verb to max, and then to say to max out. That's kind of what's happening here. He's maxing it out in order that we be strengthened out. And then, what are we strengthened for? In order that we'd be able to, it's often just translated as be able to, but the word for be able to is duname. That's a more common way. This is not that verb. This is another verb. And so this is why we pay attention to Greek and look for kind of odd constructions, because it alerts us to special meanings. So this is in order to strengthen us then, and it takes an infinitive to complement its meaning, to grasp or comprehend. Now, comprehend, that's a nice strong verb, but this verb here is stronger than that. So katalambano, if we look at it, well, for one, we can see that it's active voice, whereas here we're looking at a middle infinitive. Okay, so the middle voice is stressing the subject's participation and reflection on the action of the verb. So rather than just doing it, we're doing it with our interest in mind, doing it in a way that it impacts ourselves back. And we can see that this verb means to attain something, to win. It can also mean to like grasp in a violent kind of way, catch up with, seize, overtake. So this is a really engaging verb. And again, I ask, why do we need so much strength in this whole process? Well, we're going to see that part of what we're coming to know is the love of Christ. And again, that's what we struggle with. We struggle with God's love. We struggle understanding it. There are deep places in our hearts where we resist it, we don't want to see it, and we need strength to overcome it. Now, there are two infinitives here. So to grasp with all the saints, this is something that is not just for us, as important as we are. A lot of times we think it's just about us, just about me. Well, yes and no. Probably more no than yes. It's about us. It's about the people of God knowing who they are, what they've been given, and helping that be the basis to motivate them to share with others. So to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and the length and the depth and the height. And then he just kind of stops right there. And to know. Now this te, it's a conjunction, it's post-positive. It marks similarity with what's just gone prior. It marks a close connection in terms of content and grammatical parallel. And so it's adding on to what's just happened. So what is this? I mean, that's the big question, is what is this width, length, height, and depth? Two good alternatives. One is that these distance measuring terms have to do with measuring God's wisdom, that there's an incomprehensibility to it. So it could be just kind of pointing to the mystery of God's ways, that we can understand God's ways. And there's something appealing about that. But I think there's something else going on. And I got this clue from this article by a fella that I've met by the name of Robert Foster. And he points out in this article that these measurements occur together in Ezekiel 43, where Ezekiel is describing the rebuilding of this new eschatological temple. And particularly they appear together to describe the altar of mercy, the mercy seat. The depth of it, the height of it, the length of it. And really this is mistranslated. This should be width right here. This is the same word. So each of these words that I've highlighted here are the same four words that are occurring in Ephesians that we're looking at. Width and length. This is describing the mercy seat, the altar, where atoning sacrifice is made in the new temple. So here's the article. Here you can see it. Robert Foster, a temple in the Lord filled with the fullness of God. Context and intertextuality. So you can pause the video and find that. Well worth reading. Now we have to know that in the context of this is the fulfillment of God's promise that I will dwell in the midst forever. That's what we're seeing in Ephesians, is God, the Trinity, dwelling with us forever. And it's in the context of glory and being filled with the glory of God. So hold that thought, because we're going to go back to Ephesians here, and we're going to see that that's how it ends. That's the final purpose, is to be filled with all the fullness of God. And that's simply amazing. But so I think that this is an intertextual referent to the altar of the new temple, which is built now, chapter 2. And particularly, this altar is related to knowing the surpassing of knowledge, love of Christ. How is that experienced? His sacrificial giving, his giving of himself to us, his shedding of his blood, his sacrifice. That's already been mentioned in the context. And so, Christ dwelling in us as a temple space enables us to understand his love for us, because we understand his sacrifice and setting up this new temple space, which is us as human beings and us individually as human beings. And there's something really profound about this knowing, is that it surpasses knowledge. It's oxymoronic when you think about it, right? To know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge. Well, how can you know something that surpasses knowledge? That doesn't make sense. Paul's gone off the deep end here. He's really talking about a different kind of knowledge. He's talking about a relational knowledge. A relational knowledge that is beyond a knowing that can be just written out. It's deep. Relationships are that deep. You can't codify them. They are deep things, gifts that God gives us to steward. And so here we're to know the love, the surpassing of knowledge, the love of Christ. Love remains forever. And this then, so this is the purpose on the way then to the ultimate goal, is to be filled with all the fullness of God. And that's the final purpose. So there's been this cascading purposes. And this is really fulfilling the Old Testament hope and promise that God has made repeatedly, that he would dwell in his people, in the middle of his people, with his people. And in the gospel, we are seeing that fulfilled. So, well, I just wanted to have us work through this text. We'll need to stop there for today. It's a good place to stop, although we're not quite at the end of the chapter. There are great things ahead, but we'll continue next week in verse 20, and that will allow us then to move also into chapter 4. So thanks for joining us for this edition of Ephesians Greek Reading Group. Hope to see you next time.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.